Have you ever felt like a ghost at your own dinner table? You're the one who polished the silverware and chose the wine, but you're just part of the scenery, a silent fixture in someone else's life for 3 years. That was me. I watched my daughter in law, Amber, hold court in the house I bought, charming my son, Ryan, and his friends. But that night was different. The silence wasn't just ignorance, it was anticipation. Amber tapped her fork against her wine glass, the sound sharp and deliberate. Her eyes met mine across the table, filled not with warmth, but with a cold, triumphant gleam. She was about to make a toast, and I knew it wasn't to honor me, it was to erase me completely. If they've ever acted like you weren't there until your absence echoed louder than presence, share your story. And if this feels like your table too. My name is Grace Morgan, and for the better part of my 70 years, I believed that the quiet, steady work of a life well lived was its own reward here in Maple Creek, Oregon. Life moved with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. The crisp autumn air would paint the maple trees in hues of fire and gold, and the soft winter rains would wash the world clean, promising the vibrant burst of tulips in the spring. I had found a deep sense of peace in my retirement, a contentment that settled into my bones like the warm morning sun. The centerpiece of this peace was the sturdy craftsman house on Elm Street, a home I hadn't bought for myself, but for my son, Ryan, and his wife, Amber. It was my gift to them, a foundation upon which I hoped they would build a life of happiness. For the first year or two, it seemed my hopes had taken root. The house was filled with the sounds of a young couple settling in, the scent of fresh paint giving way to the aroma of Amber's ambitious cooking. I would visit for Sunday dinners, bringing pies from my own kitchen, and watch my son's face, etched with a deep, uncomplicated joy. He was a high school history teacher, a profession he was deeply passionate about. Though it was never one that promised wealth, he saw value in shaping young minds, a quiet nobility I had always admired. Amber, with her vibrant energy and sparkling eyes, seemed to be the perfect counterpart to his steady nature. She was launching a boutique yoga studio, a dream she spoke of with such breathless enthusiasm that it was impossible not to get swept up in her vision. But over the past year, I had begun to notice a subtle dissonance, a faint, discordant note in the harmony of their lives. It started with small things, observations that a mother makes, the kind of details that snag on the edge of your consciousness. I'd be tending to my rose bushes in the front garden when a delivery truck would pull up, not with groceries or household necessities, but with sleek, expensive boxes bearing the logos of brands I only recognized from glossy magazines. At first, I dismissed it as the enthusiasm of a young entrepreneur building her brand. Amber would unbox a new designer athletic outfit, explaining how important it was to project an image of success for her high-end clientele. It made a certain kind of sense. But my mind, trained by 32 years as a forensic accountant, had a habit of keeping a silent, running ledger. The entries in that mental ledger began to feel unbalanced. The yoga studio, now in its third year, was always described as being on the cusp of a breakthrough. Amber spoke of potential investors, of collaborations with wellness influencers, and of a growing wait list for her exclusive private sessions. Yet, when I would ask simple questions about her schedule, the answers were always curiously vague. The business was a flurry of expenses, custom branded mats, a state-of-the-art booking website, imported teas for her clients, but the income seemed to be a perpetually deferred dream. Meanwhile, the evidence of spending was undeniable and constant, a steady stream of luxury flowing into the home I had provided. The true cost of this lifestyle became painfully clear whenever I looked at my son. Ryan had started picking up extra evening tutoring sessions and was even coaching the debate team, a commitment that kept him at school late into the night. The light in his eyes, once so bright with passion for his work, had begun to dim, replaced by the dull, persistent exhaustion of someone running a race with no finish line. I saw the dark circles under his eyes deepen, the slight slump in his shoulders as he came home. Dropping his worn leather briefcase by the door, He was working himself to the bone. And I knew, with a mother's certainty, that it wasn't just to pay the electric bill or the car loan, it was to fund the beautiful, gilded cage that Amber was so meticulously constructing around them. One crisp Saturday morning, the disconnect became impossible to ignore. I had come over to drop off some fresh jam, letting myself in with the key they insisted I keep. The house was quiet. Ryan was at the school, running a weekend workshop for extra pay. I found Amber in the living room, surrounded by swatches of expensive-looking fabric. She was planning to reupholster the living room furniture, a project she announced with the casual air of someone ordering a cup of coffee, as she held up a swatch of deep velvet that probably cost more per yard than my entire monthly grocery budget. She sighed dramatically. "This house has such good bones. Grace," she said, her voice dripping with affection. "It just needs a little bit of an update to reflect our style." Our style. The words hung in the air, and I saw with perfect clarity that, in her mind, my contribution had been fully absorbed. I was no longer the benefactor. I was just the former resident of a house with good bones. The generosity had been forgotten, leaving only the asset. I decided to speak with Ryan the next day. I waited for the right moment. A quiet Sunday afternoon when Amber was out at what she called a networking brunch with other local business owners. Ryan and I sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, a space that had always been my favorite part of the house, with mugs of coffee cradled in our hands. The air was still and peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in my heart. I knew I had to tread carefully. A son's loyalty to his wife is a powerful, protective force, and the last thing I wanted was to seem like a meddling mother-in-law. I was simply a mother, worried about her child. "Honey, you seem so tired lately," I began, my voice softer than I intended. "You're working such long hours. Is everything all right?" He looked up from his coffee, a flicker of something surprise, or perhaps annoyance in his eyes before it was quickly masked. He forced a smile, but it didn't quite reach the weary corners of his eyes. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a busy time of year at school. The kids are preparing for their final exams." It was a plausible excuse, but we both knew it was only a fraction of the truth. I pressed gently, steering the conversation toward the topic that truly concerned me. "It just seems like there are a lot of expenses right now. With Amber's studio still getting off the ground, I just want to make sure you two aren't stretched too thin." His posture stiffened instantly. The casual warmth of our conversation evaporated, replaced by a cool, defensive front. It was as if I had unknowingly uttered a secret password that activated a wall of defense around him and his marriage. "Mom, please," he said, his tone laced with an exasperation that stung me. "We're fine, I told you. Amber's business is just about to take off. These things take time and investment. You have to spend money to make money. You know." The words sounded hollow, like a rehearsed script he had repeated to himself many times. They weren't his words, they were Amber's, echoing through my son's mouth. "She's working incredibly hard on this," he continued, his gaze drifting out the window, avoiding mine. "She's building a brand, making connections. It's not easy. The last thing she needs is for my own mother to doubt her." The accusation, though softly spoken, landed like a slap in his eyes. My concern had been twisted into doubt, my worry into a lack of faith in his wife. I saw then how thoroughly Amber had woven her narrative into the fabric of his perception. She wasn't just his wife. She was a struggling visionary whom he needed to protect, even from his own mother's gentle questions. I realized with a chilling certainty that I could not win this argument, because I was not arguing with my son. I was arguing with the ghost of Amber's influence. I slowly withdrew, nodding my head as if I understood. "Of course, dear. I didn't mean to imply otherwise. You know I only want the best for both of you." But the retreat was purely strategic. As I watched him, relieved that the uncomfortable conversation was over, a cold resolve settled over me. My gentle warnings were useless. My concern was a language he was no longer fluent in. The path of direct conversation was closed to me, blocked by a wall of misplaced loyalty and masterful manipulation. If I was going to protect my son, and the legacy his father and I had worked so hard to build for him, I would have to do it myself. In silence. Later that evening, back in the quiet of my own home, I walked to the old oak filing cabinet in my study. My hands were steady as I unlocked the bottom drawer, the one that held the most important documents of my life. I pushed aside old tax returns and investment statements until my fingers found the thick, crisp folder I was looking for. Inside, nestled in protective plastic, was the original deed to the house on Elm Street, bearing one name and one name only, Grace Morgan. Alongside it was the carefully drafted rental agreement I had made them sign 3 years ago, the one that framed my monthly financial support as their rent, a document that legally defined their position not as homeowners, but as my tenants. At the time, I had done it as a quiet measure of protection for my investment. Now, as I laid the papers on my desk under the lamplight, I realized they were something more. They were my leverage. The bad feeling I'd had for months had finally solidified into a plan. The forensic accountant wasn't retired anymore. The weeks that followed my decision were a study in quiet observation. I held the knowledge of my power like a hidden card, waiting for the precise moment when the game would demand it be played. I did not act immediately. Instead, I watched. And with each passing day, my resolve hardened. I watched as more packages arrived, as Ryan's car pulled into the driveway later and later, and as Amber's laughter filled the rooms of my house, a sound that now struck me as proprietary, almost conquering. The final, unavoidable confrontation came, as these things often do. Under the guise of a celebration, Ryan had called me, his voice filled with a rare excitement, the head of his department at the high school, a man whose respect Ryan had been trying to earn for years, had accepted an invitation for dinner. It was a crucial evening for his career, he explained, and he needed everything to be perfect. And so, I agreed to help. On that fateful Saturday evening, I arrived to find the house transformed. Amber had a flair for presentation. I had to grant her that. The dining room table was set with immaculate precision, the silverware I had polished just that morning gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. A fragrant, expensive-looking bouquet of lilies and eucalyptus served as the centerpiece, and the air was filled with the savory aroma of the roast beef I had spent the afternoon preparing my late husband's favorite recipe, one I had taught Amber myself. The guests, Ryan's department head and his wife, were pleasant and engaging. For a while, I allowed myself to be lulled into the performance of a happy, supportive family. I played the part of the gracious matriarch, smiling and refilling wine glasses, a benign presence in the background. Amber, however, was not content with the background. She was the star of the evening, a role she inhabited with breathtaking confidence. She held court at the head of the table, captivating the guests with animated stories about the launch of her wellness brand. She spoke of manifestation and synergy, using a lexicon of corporate buzzwords that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. She was radiant, charming, and utterly convincing. I watched my son watch her, his face a mask of pure adoration. He was mesmerized, hanging on her every word, his pride so palpable it was almost a physical presence at the table. He saw a brilliant, ambitious visionary. I saw a performer delivering the role of a lifetime, funded by the slow, steady depletion of his own life force. The conversation eventually turned, as it often does among professionals, to careers and future plans. Mrs. Albright, the department head's wife, turned to me with a kind smile. "Grace, you must be enjoying your retirement so much," she said warmly. "It must be wonderful to have the time to relax after so many years of hard work." It was an innocent, polite question, but in that moment, it felt like a spotlight swinging in my direction, a spotlight Amber immediately felt the need to share. Before I could form a reply, Amber let out a small, theatrical laugh. She raised her wine glass, tapping her perfectly manicured fingernail against the crystal. A sharp, insistent sound that drew every eye in the room. The low hum of conversation ceased. The air grew still with anticipation. "Oh, Grace is an expert at relaxing," Amber began, her voice dripping with a cloying, false sweetness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "She's just had some wonderful news on that front. Actually," she paused, letting the silence stretch, ensuring she had everyone's complete and undivided attention. I felt a cold dread begin to pool in my stomach. I knew, with absolute certainty, what was coming. She's just shared that she's unemployed again, after leaving her last little part-time job for health reasons. She made air quotes around the words health reasons, a small, vicious gesture that did not go unnoticed. Her eyes locked with mine across the table, and in their depths, I saw a cold, triumphant gleam. This was not a joke. It was an execution. Then came the final, brutal blow. She smiled, a wide, predatory smile that did not reach her eyes, and delivered the line she had clearly been rehearsing. "How does it feel?" she asked, her voice now carrying a sharp, mocking edge that sliced through the polite atmosphere of the dinner party. "To be a loser at your age?" The word hung in the air, ugly and obscene. Loser. The silence that followed was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that fell over the table. The Albrights stared down at their plates, their faces frozen in masks of horrified embarrassment. The clinking of cutlery stopped. Even the flickering candles seemed to hold their breath. In that moment of suspended time, my gaze flew to the one person in the room who mattered, the one person whose defense I craved, whose loyalty I had a right to expect. I looked at my son. Ryan's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. I saw a flicker of something in them: disbelief, maybe even horror. He opened his mouth as if to speak, a protest forming on his lips. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, for him to say something, anything, to tell her she had gone too far, to defend the mother who had given him everything. But the moment passed. His mouth closed. He looked from me to Amber, then down at his hands, which were clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table. He said nothing. Absolutely nothing. And in his silence, I felt a pain far sharper and more profound than any insult Amber could ever conceive. Her words were a childish taunt. His silence was a fundamental betrayal. It was the sound of a choice being made, and he had not chosen me. And he had not. A strange calm washed over me then. The searing pain of my son's betrayal did not break me. Instead, it forged something new within me, something hard and clear and unyielding, the part of me that had been holding on to hope, the soft, maternal part that kept making excuses for his blindness, simply withered and died. The emotional calculus of the situation became starkly, brutally simple. The hurt was gone, replaced by a cold, quiet clarity. The woman sitting opposite me was not family, she was a predator. And the man sitting beside her, my own son, was a willing captive. The time for gentle warnings was over. The time for hoping he would see the truth was over. The game had been called. And now, it was my turn to play. I deliberately set down my wine glass, the soft clink against the tablecloth the only sound in the cavernous silence. My hand, I was pleased to note, was perfectly steady. I folded my hands in my lap and looked directly at Amber, whose smug smile was just beginning to falter, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty at my lack of reaction. "Well, Amber," I said, my voice even and calm, as if I were merely commenting on the weather. "That's an interesting question." I let my gaze sweep across the mortified faces of our guests before returning to her. "I imagine," I continued, my tone measured and thoughtful, "it feels about the same as learning you're about to be evicted from the home you've been living in, rent-free." For the past 3 years, the color drained from Amber's face. The transformation was astonishingly fast, from smug satisfaction to a waxy, corpse-like pallor in under 2 seconds. What? What are you talking about? She stammered, her voice a mere whisper of the confident tone she had used just moments before. Ryan's head snapped towards me, his eyes wide with confusion. Mom, what is this? I ignored him. My focus was entirely on Amber. I'm talking about this house, dear, I said, allowing a small, sweet smile to touch my lips, mimicking the one she had worn. This beautiful craftsman with the good bones, the one you've been so enthusiastically redecorating, the one you so casually refer to as yours on your charming social media posts. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in, letting everyone at the table understand that the ground beneath their feet was shifting. The thing is, I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nonetheless carried to every corner of the silent room. This house doesn't belong to Ryan. It has never belonged to him. I held Amber's terrified gaze. It belongs to me. The shockwave hit Ryan first. Mom, that's not true. We have a mortgage. We make payments. His voice trailed off as a dawning horror spread across his features. Oh, sweetheart, I said, finally turning to him, my voice softening with a pity I couldn't entirely suppress. Those payments you've been making every month? They weren't going to a bank. They were going to me. It was rent. Ryan, it has always been rent. I stood up then, my movement slow and deliberate. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress, feeling a sense of profound and final authority settle over me. When your student loan debt kept you from qualifying for a mortgage 3 years ago, I didn't co-sign a loan. I explained to the room at large, my voice clear and steady. I bought this house outright, with cash, from your father's life insurance policy. The deed is in my name and my name alone. I looked back at Amber, whose mouth was now opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. You've been particularly cruel tonight. Amber, I said, my voice losing all its warmth, becoming as sharp and cold as ice. So allow me to be crystal clear. You and my son have exactly 30 days to find another place to live. The lease, as it were, is terminated. I picked up my purse and shawl from the chair beside me. I gave a polite, almost apologetic nod to the Albrights. I do apologize that your evening was interrupted. I said to them, thank you for coming. Then, I turned back to my son, who looked as if his entire world had just crumbled to dust around him. Ryan, we will talk tomorrow, after you've had some time to process this. My final words were for Amber. I leaned in just close enough for her to hear me clearly. I suggest you start looking for apartments you can actually afford on a part-time yoga instructor's salary. I murmured. The rental market in Maple Creek is brutal this time of year. And with that, I turned and walked out of my own dining room, leaving them all sitting in the ruins of the perfect evening Amber had tried to orchestrate. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The morning after the dinner party dawned cold and gray, the sky over Maple Creek a uniform slate that mirrored the emptiness I felt inside. I had not slept. Instead, I sat in the deep armchair in my living room, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. As the events of the evening replayed themselves in a relentless loop, each detail was etched into my memory with painful clarity: the shocked faces of our guests, the waxy pallor of Amber's face, and the cavernous, damning silence of my son. There was no triumph in what I had done, no satisfying warmth of victory. There was only the heavy, aching certainty of necessity, the profound sadness that comes from having to amputate a part of your own life to save the rest. I had thrown a grenade into the heart of my family, and I knew the shrapnel was still flying. The inevitable phone call came just after 9 o'clock, but it was not the angry, shouting tirade I might have expected. It was Ryan, his voice small and broken. He asked if he could come over, and I simply said, "Of course, sweetheart." When he arrived at my door 20 minutes later, he looked like a ghost. His hair was unkempt, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and he wore the same clothes from the night before, now hopelessly wrinkled. He looked not like a 35-year-old man, but like the lost little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Seeking a comfort I was no longer sure I could provide. He didn't speak at first, just sank onto my sofa and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I sat with him in that silence, my heart aching with a sorrow so deep it felt physical. This was the cost of my actions, this raw, visible pain in my only child. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a desperate, pleading confusion. "Mom, you can't do this," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You can't just throw us out. This is our home." He still called it our home, even after my revelation. The delusion was that complete. Amber is a wreck. She made a mistake. She was stressed. She said a stupid, horrible thing. But to do this, in front of everyone, to humiliate her like that, he was defending her. Even now, after she had publicly tried to destroy me, he was defending her. I listened, my expression calm, my hands resting in my lap. I did not argue or raise my voice. I simply let him speak. And with every word he uttered, the last vestiges of my maternal softness calcified into something harder, more pragmatic. He spoke of their love, of the future they were planning, of the pressure Amber was under to make her business a success. He painted a picture of a fragile, ambitious woman who had simply cracked under the strain, and of me as the cold, unforgiving force that had brought down a disproportionate punishment. He did not seem to remember that the first stone had been thrown by her, or that his own silence had been the blow that truly wounded me, in his version of the story. Her cruelty was a momentary lapse, while my response was a calculated act of war. "I know you've never really liked her," he said finally, his voice tinged with a bitterness that cut me to the quick. "But she is my wife, Mom Tsigi, and I love her. Please, just rescind the eviction. Give us a chance to make this right." I looked at my son, at his earnest, pleading face, and I felt a profound sense of loss. He was not seeing the situation. He was seeing a narrative Amber had undoubtedly fed him, a story where she was the victim. He was blind, and my words could not make him see. My heart broke for him, but my resolve did not waver. "Ryan," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "the decision is final. The 30-day notice stands." He stared at me, his last hope dying in his eyes. And after a long, heavy moment, he stood up and walked out of my house without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, and in that sound, I knew I was truly alone in this fight. The pain of that realization was immense, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to consider his feelings. I only had to consider the facts. I walked into my study, the room where I had spent decades untangling the complex financial lies of strangers. Now, I would turn those skills inward, toward the lies that had taken root in my own family. I sat at my large oak desk, pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen, and wrote a title at the top of the page, Project Amber. The mother in me was grieving, but the forensic accountant was ready to work. I began with the most public of ledgers, her social media. For hours, I scrolled through years of posts, no longer as a passive, occasionally proud mother-in-law, but as an investigator searching for patterns. I ignored the smiling selfies and the inspirational quotes. I was hunting for data. I built a spreadsheet, my fingers flying across the keyboard with a muscle memory I thought I had lost. Column 1, date of post. Column 2, stated activity. Column 3, location tags. Column 4, other individuals tagged. Column 5, Observable assets, new clothes, jewelry, restaurant meals. A picture began to emerge from the digital noise. Amber's yoga studio had no physical address because it didn't exist. Her business was entirely mobile, a series of private, in home sessions for the wealthy women of Maple Creek. I cross referenced the names she tagged with public property records, confirming that these sessions took place in sprawling estates in the richest parts of town. I found post after post where a client would thank Amber by name for a rejuvenating private session, often with a picture of Amber posing in their lavish living room or poolside patio. These were her invoices, proudly displayed for the world to see, yet completely off the books. I meticulously documented each one, taking screenshots and saving the images to a secure file. I estimated her undeclared cash income, and while it was substantial, a cold knot of certainty in my gut told me it still wasn't enough. The math was wrong. The sheer volume of her spending on luxury goods, the constant travel, the talk of reupholstering furniture with designer fabric, it required a level of cash flow that even a successful cash-only business couldn't fully explain. There was another source, a missing variable in the equation, and I knew I could not find it by sitting at my desk. For 3 days, I wrestled with the decision. My investigation had hit a wall, a barrier between the digital world and the physical one. I had a clear picture of Amber's public-facing business and its fraudulent nature, but the missing income source remained a ghost in the machine. To find it, I needed eyes and ears on the ground. I needed to know where she went when her phone was turned off, who she met for those long networking lunches, and what happened during the vast, unaccounted-for hours of her days. This was the domain of surveillance, a world I understood in theory but had no practical experience in. The thought of hiring a private investigator felt like a monumental step, a crossing of a Rubicon from which there was no return. It felt sordid, a tactic reserved for cheap novels and daytime television. But then I would think of Ryan's exhausted face, of the years of his life being siphoned away to fund a lie, and the moral ambiguity would vanish. This was not a petty domestic squabble. This was a forensic investigation into what I now suspected was a significant and deliberate fraud being perpetrated against my son. Protecting him was not just a mother's instinct, it was a fiduciary duty to the legacy his father had left behind. On the fourth day, I made the call. I didn't look for a flashy firm from the city. I found a small, discreet agency in a neighboring town run by a man named Frank Doyle, a retired police detective with a reputation for being thorough, quiet, and ruthlessly efficient. His online reviews used words like professional and unflappable, which was exactly what I needed. Our meeting took place in his nondescript office, a room so bland and forgettable it was clear he valued function over form. Frank was a man in his late 60s, with watchful eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened without interruption as I laid out the situation in cool, professional terms. I did not speak of my hurt feelings or my son's betrayal. I presented him with the facts as subject. Amber Collins, with a lifestyle that far exceeded her known income, a suspected undeclared cash business, and a need to identify any and all other sources of revenue. I handed him a slim file containing my spreadsheet, the screenshots, and a list of Amber's known associates. I was not a client hiring a detective. I was one professional contracting another. He reviewed my work with a flicker of professional respect in his eyes. "You've done most of my job for me, Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice a low gravel. "What's the one question you need answered? Where does the rest of the money come from?" I replied without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "I'll find out." The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my daily routine gardening, errands, calls with friends, but my mind was elsewhere, operating on a second, hidden track of anxious anticipation. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat. I tried not to imagine what Frank was discovering, what sordid details might be unearthed. I simply waited, trusting the process, trusting the cold, hard logic of the investigation I had set into motion. The call finally came the following Tuesday. Grace, Frank's voice said, using my first name as we had agreed. I think you should come in. There's something you need to see. I drove to his office with a sense of grim finality. The truth, whatever it was waiting for me in that sterile room. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit and slid a plain manila folder across the desk. Her routine is mostly as you suspected, he began. Private yoga sessions in the mornings. But her afternoons are spoken for. I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a series of photographs, all taken with a long lens camera, all perfectly in focus. My breath caught in my chest. There was Amber. Not in yoga attire, but in elegant dresses and expensive coats. In every single photo. She was with a man. A handsome, well-dressed man with silvering temples and a confident smile. I didn't recognize him. They were pictured at an upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town, laughing intimately over a bottle of wine. They were seen entering a boutique hotel, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The final photos were the most damning, the two of them browsing in a high-end jewelry store. Amber holding up a diamond bracelet to her wrist, her face alight with avarice. His name is Carter Miller, Frank said, his voice flat and devoid of judgment as he slid a typed report toward me. Married, owns one of the largest construction companies in the state. He's been transferring significant sums of money to a private account in your daughter-in-law's name for the past 18 months. The transfers are listed as consulting fees for wellness and corporate branding advice. I stared at the photographs, at the undeniable evidence of a long-term, clandestine affair. The initial shock of the betrayal was there, a sharp, painful jolt. But it was quickly overshadowed by something else. A feeling I recognized instantly: the cold, satisfying click of a final puzzle piece slotting into place. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business transaction. Carter Miller wasn't just her lover. He was the missing variable. He was the second, and far more lucrative, source of income. The affair explained everything. The spending, the secrecy, the confidence that bordered on arrogance. Amber wasn't just cheating on my son. She was running a sophisticated, multifaceted operation to fund her life, with Ryan providing the foundation of legitimacy and a free place to live. While Carter Miller provided the vast sums of disposable cash, the scale of the deception was breathtaking. And in that moment, I knew that a simple eviction was no longer a sufficient response. This wasn't just about getting her out of my house. This was about dismantling her entire fraudulent enterprise. I drove home from Frank Doyle's office in a state of preternatural calm. The manila folder lay on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, damning testament to the depth of Amber's depravity. There was no rage, no searing jealousy on behalf of my son, not even a profound sense of shock. The emotional centers of my brain seemed to have been bypassed entirely, leaving only the cold, clear hum of analytical thought. The forensic accountant had taken complete control. The photographs and financial statements were not evidence of a simple affair. They were exhibits in a case of complex, premeditated fraud. The immediate, instinctual desire was to storm back to the house on Elm Street, to throw this folder at my son's feet and force him to see the viper he had been defending. But I suppressed that impulse with ruthless efficiency. It would be a tactical error of the highest order. Confronting them now would accomplish nothing. Amber would construct a web of elaborate lies, painting herself as a misunderstood victim, perhaps even accusing me of forging the documents or hiring a detective to manufacture a fantasy. Ryan, in his current state of willful blindness, would be a receptive audience for her performance. He would see this evidence not as liberation, but as a cruel, targeted attack by a jealous mother, a chaotic, tear-filled confrontation would only serve to muddy the waters, to turn a clear-cut case of fraud into a messy, he said, she said family drama. It would be emotionally gratifying for a fleeting moment, and strategically disastrous in the long run. My objective was not to win an argument, it was to win the war. And in this war, Amber was not the only perpetrator. Carter Miller was her accomplice, and his wife, Paige, was the other primary victim. My path forward became clear. Before I could dismantle Amber's operation, I needed to consolidate my assets, and my most valuable potential asset was the one person who had as much, if not more, to lose than I did Paige Miller. She was not my rival for a man's affection. She was my counterpart. Another woman whose family and financial security were being systematically dismantled by the same predator. If I approached her correctly, she could be more than just a source of information. She could be an ally. That evening, I turned my investigative skills toward a new subject. I needed to understand the woman I was about to approach. I conducted a thorough, discreet search on Paige Miller, piecing together a portrait from public records, charity event mentions, and old newspaper articles about her husband's booming construction empire. She was not the flashy socialite I might have expected. Paige Miller was a respected watercolor artist with a modest but critically acclaimed career of her own. She had a master's degree in fine arts and sat on the board of the local art museum. Her digital footprint was minimal and professional, a simple artist's website showcasing her ethereal landscapes. No public social media accounts to be found. She was, by all appearances, an intelligent, private, and dignified woman who had been eclipsed by the shadow of her husband's immense wealth. This information was crucial. She was not someone who would respond to a hysterical, accusatory phone call. My approach had to be as professional and discreet as she appeared to be. I found the email address on her art website and spent nearly an hour composing a message that was precise, respectful, and intentionally vague. Dear Mrs. Miller, I wrote, my name is Grace Morgan. Forgive this unsolicited contact, but I am a private party conducting a sensitive financial review. Your husband's name, Carter Miller, has appeared in connection with certain transactions involving my family's assets. I believe it would be to our mutual benefit to have a brief, confidential conversation regarding these matters. If you are amenable, I am available to meet at a time and place of your choosing. I read it over a dozen times, ensuring it sounded more like a corporate auditor than a scorned mother-in-law. It was impersonal, professional, and just alarming enough to warrant a response. I sent it, and then I waited, knowing that the next move in this dangerous game was now up to her. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was as brief and professional as my own. Mrs. Morgan, I can be at the lobby cafe of the Grand Hotel downtown, tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Paige Miller. The Grand Hotel was the perfect choice, impersonal, elegant, and large enough for two people to have a conversation without being overheard by the town's gossip mongers. She was cautious and smart. I felt a flicker of hope. This was a woman who understood the rules of engagement. The next day, I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a secluded corner table with a clear view of the entrance. I ordered a pot of tea and waited, the manila folder resting heavily in my briefcase. Paige Miller arrived at precisely 3 o'clock. She was as elegant as I had imagined. Dressed in a simple but beautifully tailored gray coat, her silver blonde hair pulled back in a neat chignon. But it was her eyes that struck me. They were the color of a winter sea, and they held a deep, weary sadness, the unmistakable look of a woman who had been living with a quiet, unnamed dread for a very long time. She carried herself with a fragile poise, like a porcelain vase that had already been cracked and carefully glued back together. Mrs. Morgan, she said, her voice soft but steady as she sat down. Thank you for reaching out. Your email was intriguing. I met her gaze directly, wanting to establish a foundation of mutual respect before diving into the sordid details. Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Paige, I said, making the deliberate choice to use her first name. I know this is highly unusual. Please believe me when I say I would not have contacted you unless the matter was of the utmost seriousness, affecting both of our families. I started not with the affair, but with the finances, laying the groundwork as a fellow professional. I explained that in the course of a financial review. I had uncovered a series of large, undocumented payments being made to a member of my family. As I spoke, I watched her face. There was no surprise, only a flicker of pained recognition. It was the look of a woman hearing her deepest fears spoken aloud for the first time. I pushed the manila folder gently across the table. "The payments were being made by your husband," I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. "To my daughter-in-law, Amber Collins." Paige's hands, which had been resting calmly on the table, tightened around her teacup. She didn't flinch, but a muscle in her jaw tightened. She had been expecting this. Perhaps not the specific name, but the general shape of the betrayal. She had been living with the ghost of it for months, and now I was here to give that ghost a name. "The payments were disguised as consulting fees," I continued, "but my investigation suggested a different kind of relationship. I hired a professional to confirm my suspicions. The results are in that folder." She stared at the folder for a long moment, as if it were a venomous snake. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, she opened it. She looked at the bank statements first, her artist's eyes scanning the columns of numbers, her expression hardening with each line item. Then, she looked at the photographs. I watched as the last vestiges of hope drained from her face, replaced by a profound and devastating certainty. She did not cry. Her dignity was a fortress. But I saw the subtle tremor in her hands as she placed the last photo back in the folder, her movement slow and deliberate. She closed the folder, pushed it back toward me, and looked at me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to let spill over. I I knew something was wrong, but I let him convince me I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It's a strange thing to feel so heartbroken and so sane, all at the same time. In that moment of shared, quiet devastation, a silent pact was formed between us. We were not rivals, we were allies. Two intelligent women who had been grievously underestimated by the people closest to them. "He told me he was investing in a new wellness startup," Paige said, her voice growing stronger, the initial shock giving way to a cold, rising anger. "He said it was a brilliant new concept and he was getting in on the ground floor. He became obsessed with it. Moving money from our joint accounts into a new business account I wasn't a signatory on. He told me it was for tax purposes." I listened, my mind fitting the pieces together. The puzzle was becoming larger and more intricate than I had ever imagined. "I have the statements from our joint accounts," Paige continued, her resolve hardening. "I can show you the initial transfers. He moved over $100,000 to start with. And then the credit card bills started coming in. Thousands of dollars a month at designer stores, spas, a jeweler in the city. He told me they were corporate expenses for brand development." The picture was now sickeningly clear. Amber hadn't just been accepting gifts from a wealthy lover. She had orchestrated a full-scale financial assault, convincing Carter to bankroll her entire fraudulent enterprise under the guise of a legitimate business investment. She had created a shell company with his money, a company that produced nothing but receipts for her own lavish lifestyle. We sat there for the next hour in that quiet corner of the hotel cafe, two strangers transforming into a single investigative unit. Paige laid out her financial documents next to my surveillance reports. We connected the dots. A grim exercise in financial forensics. A large transfer from Carter's account in May corresponded to a trip to Italy Amber had taken in June, which she had told Ryan was a yoga retreat, paid for by her booming business. A charge for a diamond bracelet from a luxury jeweler matched the one Frank had photographed her admiring. The most chilling discovery was the paperwork for a new limited liability company, a shell corporation called Ambiance Wellness, LLC. Carter Miller was listed as the primary investor, but the majority shareholder and sole managing partner was Amber Collins. He hadn't just been funding her lifestyle, He had been actively transferring his assets into her name, giving her legal ownership and control. I looked at Paige, and she looked at me. The full, monstrous scope of the deception was laid bare on the table between us. My son was being used for his home, his stability, and the legitimacy of his name. A steady, hardworking teacher who provided the perfect cover story. Carter Miller was being used for his vast wealth, his assets systematically siphoned off into a corporate entity that Amber alone controlled. She was a parasite with two hosts, bleeding them both dry in different ways. "This isn't an affair," I said, my voice a low, steady whisper. "This is a conspiracy. She's running a long-term fraud operation." Paige nodded slowly, her beautiful, sad eyes now gleaming with a hard, determined light. The betrayed wife was gone. In her place was a woman who had just been handed a weapon. "He didn't just cheat on me," she said, her voice filled with ice. "He conspired to steal from our family, from our children." She slid the folder containing her bank statements back into her purse and stood up. "What's our next move, Grace?" Paige's question, "What's our next move?" Grace, hung in the air between us, a declaration of alliance forged in the crucible of our shared betrayal. In that moment, we were no longer two separate victims. We were a single, cohesive unit with a shared objective. We spent another hour in that quiet hotel cafe, mapping out our strategy with the cold precision of generals planning a campaign. We had a wealth of evidence, but raw data was not enough. To be effective, it had to be deployed with tactical precision. A full frontal assault, revealing everything at once, would be messy and unpredictable. It would give Amber and Carter time to collude, to hide assets, to create a unified, false narrative. Our strategy had to be a two-pronged attack, designed to isolate them from each other and dismantle their individual power bases simultaneously. Paige, with the guidance of her own legal team, would handle the financial decapitation. She would begin the process of legally freezing Carter's assets, citing financial malfeasance and the unauthorized transfer of marital property into a shell corporation. My role was more delicate. I would handle Amber. My objective was not to destroy her, but to neutralize her, to corner her so completely that when the final blow fell, she would have no room to maneuver, no one to turn to, and no lies left to tell. We decided I would confront her not with the affair. The emotional shrapnel of that revelation was a weapon I would reserve for my son, but with the cold, hard, and undeniable facts of her financial fraud. We would sever her financial lifeline and dismantle her credibility in two separate, coordinated strikes. I went home and made the call. When Amber answered, her voice was a mixture of defensiveness and forced nonchalance. I kept my own tone cool and businesslike. "Amber," I said, "I think it's time we discuss the practical terms of your departure from the house. There are matters of property and finances that need to be settled." There was a brief silence on the other end, and I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. She likely saw this as an opportunity to negotiate, to bully me into some sort of settlement. "Fine," she said, her voice regaining its familiar arrogance. "My mother will be joining me. She advises me on all my legal affairs." It was the exact response I had anticipated. She was bringing reinforcements. Believing this would be a contest of intimidation, it played perfectly into my hands. "That will be fine," I replied. "My home, tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock." They arrived at my front door at precisely 2 o'clock, a united front of entitlement and aggression. Amber was dressed in an expensive cream-colored pantsuit, an outfit designed to project power. But her eyes darted around nervously. Her mother, Catherine, was a more polished and formidable version of her daughter. She was impeccably dressed, her face a smooth, unreadable mask, and she carried a leather briefcase that she placed on the coffee table with an air of immense self-importance. They were here to strong-arm a lonely old widow into submission. They had no idea they were walking into a forensic audit. I served them tea, a small domestic ritual that seemed to heighten the tension in the room. Catherine began, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Grace," she started, foregoing any pleasantries, We are here to discuss this unfortunate and frankly illegal eviction notice. You should know that Amber and Ryan have established residency. You can't simply throw them out without due process. We are prepared to file a lawsuit citing tenant harassment and seeking damages for emotional distress. She spoke with the rehearsed confidence of someone used to winning arguments through sheer force of will. Amber sat beside her, nodding along, a smug little smile playing on her lips. I let them finish, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I did not engage with their threats or defend my position. I simply listened patiently, allowing them to lay all their useless cards on the table. When Catherine had finally exhausted her litany of legal threats, a silence fell over the room. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Before she could answer, I reached for a slim, unmarked folder I had placed on the end table beside my chair. It was not the folder from Frank Doyle, filled with pictures of her daughter's infidelity. This one was different. This was my own work. I appreciate your perspective on landlord-tenant law. Catherine, I said, my voice calm and even. But I'm afraid you've come prepared for the wrong conversation. We're not here to discuss the eviction. We're here to discuss your daughter's federal tax liability. I slid the folder across the coffee table. It stopped directly in front of Amber. Her smug expression faltered, replaced by a look of genuine confusion. With a hesitant hand, she opened it. Inside, there were no legal documents, no eviction notices. There were only spreadsheets, printouts from social media, and neatly organized pages of documentation. The first page was a list of names the wealthiest women in Maple Creek. The following pages contained screenshots of their Instagram and Facebook posts, each one showing Amber in their home, and each one accompanied by a caption thanking her for a private yoga session. The final pages were a meticulously calculated spreadsheet. It detailed over 2 years of undocumented cash-based income, cross-referenced by date and client. At the bottom of the final page, 2 numbers were circled in red ink. One was the estimated total of her undeclared income, a figure well into the 6 figures. The second was the estimated amount of federal and state taxes she had evaded, plus accrued penalties and interest. Amber's face went white. She looked from the papers to me, her eyes wide with panic. Catherine snatched the folder and began to flip through the pages, her own expression shifting from confident aggression to stunned disbelief. What is this? She hissed. This is evidence, I replied, my voice still perfectly level. It's a preliminary workup of your daughter's tax fraud. For the past 3 years, she has been running a highly profitable cash business while reporting zero income to the government. She has been using my son's salary and my home to subsidize her life, all while systematically defrauding the United States Treasury and the state of Oregon. I leaned back in my chair. As a former forensic accountant for the IRS, I can tell you that they take these things very, very seriously. The penalties are not just financial, it often involves prison time. The air in the room grew thick and cold. The mother and daughter exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic. The bluster and threats had completely vanished, replaced by the terrified silence of 2 people who had just realized they were caught in a steel trap. Catherine, ever the fighter, made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. You can't prove any of this, she snapped, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. This is nothing but speculation. You have no right. I held up a hand to stop her, and the gesture was so imbued with quiet authority that she actually fell silent. Oh, Catherine, I said, and for the first time. I allowed a small, pitying smile to touch my lips. Every transaction is corroborated by a public social media post, a location tag, and a named witness. It's one of the sloppiest cases of tax evasion I've ever seen. I stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. I am not going to debate this with you. I just wanted you both to have a clear understanding of the situation before you make any more legal threats. I paused at the door of the study. I'm sure the Internal Revenue Service would be very interested in this file. I suggest you decide what your next move is very, very carefully. The following afternoon was the culmination of all my planning. The moment the disparate threads of my investigation would be pulled together into a final, inescapable knot. I sat in my study, the house quiet around me, a silent command center for the operation about to unfold. I had spoken with Paige that morning and with Frank Doyle just an hour before. All the pieces were in place. We were all synchronized, waiting for the designated moment, 2 o'clock. My heart was pounding, not with fear or excitement, but with the adrenalized focus of a surgeon before the first incision. This was a delicate operation, and the timing had to be perfect. At precisely 2:00 p.m., I sent a simple one-word text message to Frank. Now, in my mind's eye, I pictured the first domino falling in a lawyer's office across town. Paige Miller would be signing the final document for an emergency motion to be filed with the court, citing evidence of financial malfeasance and the fraudulent transfer of marital assets into a shell corporation. The motion would seek to immediately freeze all personal and joint accounts held by her husband, Carter Miller, as well as all assets of the Ambiance Wellness, LLC. At that very moment, the river of money that had been funding Amber's entire life was being dammed at its source. She didn't know it yet, but her financial world had just come to a screeching halt. Simultaneously, a second, more personal domino was set to fall. I pictured Frank Doyle, sitting in his car a few blocks from the high school where Ryan worked. He would pull up my son's number on his phone, a number I had reluctantly provided. He would attach a single, high-resolution image to a new message. Then, he would type a short, innocuous text. A few seconds later, my own phone buzzed with a forwarded copy of the message he had sent to Ryan, a confirmation that the second strike was away. The message was simple: so sorry, wrong number. Below it was the photograph. It was the one of Amber and Carter at the jewelry store. The one where she was holding the diamond bracelet up to the light, her face ecstatic. Carter was looking at her not with lust, but with the indulgent, proprietary smile of a man looking at a prized possession he had just purchased. The intimacy and the financial transaction were captured in a single, devastating frame. Now, all I could do was wait. I sat at my desk, staring at the silent phone, my mind consumed with thoughts of my son. I imagined him in his classroom during his free period, his phone buzzing on his desk. I pictured him picking it up, seeing the unknown number, reading the apology, and then seeing the photograph. I imagined the confusion on his face, followed by the dawning, sickening wave of recognition. In that one moment, every lie he had been told, every doubt he had suppressed, every warning I had ever given him would crash down upon him with the force of a tidal wave. The picture was the one piece of evidence that could bypass his defenses, a visual truth so undeniable that it would shatter the carefully constructed reality Amber had built around him. The hours that followed were agonizing. I did not hear from Ryan. The silence was unnerving, a void where I had expected an explosion. I paced the floors of my house, my thoughts racing. Had the plan worked? Had he seen it? Had he confronted her? The uncertainty was a physical weight. Finally, just after 6 o'clock. As the evening light began to fade, I saw his truck pull into my driveway. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there for a long time, the engine off, a lone silhouette in the deepening twilight. When he finally walked to my door, he looked like a man who had aged a decade in a single afternoon. His face was a gray, hollowed-out mask of grief. The blindness was gone, but what was left in its place was an agony that was almost unbearable to witness. He didn't speak when I let him in. He just walked into the living room and sank into the same armchair his father used to favor. She didn't deny it, he said, his voice a dead, emotionless monotone. I showed her the picture. She didn't even try to lie. He told me what had happened in a series of broken, disjointed sentences. He had left school early and gone to the house, He had found Amber on the phone, her voice high with panic. He later realized she must have been trying to call Carter, trying to figure out why her credit cards were suddenly being declined. When Ryan showed her the photo on his phone, her face had simply crumpled. The performance was over. The lies had run out. All the fight had gone out of her, leaving only the empty shell of her greed. She just kept saying, "I can explain," Ryan whispered, staring at nothing. "But there is no explanation for this, is there, Mom?" I went to him then and put my arms around my son's trembling shoulders. The unveiling was complete. The truth, in all its ugly, brutal glory, was finally out in the open. And we were left to pick up the pieces. My digital investigation, as thorough as it was, had hit a wall. I had a clear picture of Amber's fraudulent cash business, but the numbers still didn't add up. The sheer volume of her spending on luxury goods and travel required a level of cash flow that even her successful side business couldn't fully explain. The missing income source remained a ghost in the machine, a variable I couldn't solve from my desk. To find the truth, I needed eyes on the ground. And for that, I had to cross a Rubicon I had never anticipated hiring a private investigator. The thought felt sordid, a step into a world of cheap novels. But the memory of Ryan's exhausted face was a constant reminder that this was not a petty squabble. It was a forensic investigation to protect what was left of his future and the legacy his father had left behind. On the fourth day, I made the call. I didn't look for a flashy firm from the city. I found a small, discreet agency in a neighboring town run by a man named Frank Doyle, a retired police detective with a reputation for being thorough, quiet, and ruthlessly efficient. His online reviews used words like professional and unflappable, which was exactly what I needed. Our meeting took place in his nondescript office, a room so bland and forgettable, it was clear he valued function over form. Frank was a man in his late 60s, with watchful eyes and a calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. He listened without interruption as I laid out the situation in cool, professional terms. I did not speak of my hurt feelings or my son's betrayal. I presented him with the facts of subject. Amber Collins, with a lifestyle that far exceeded her known income, a suspected undeclared cash business, and a need to identify any and all other sources of revenue. I handed him a slim file containing my spreadsheet, the screenshots, and a list of Amber's known associates. He reviewed my work with a flicker of professional respect in his eyes. "You've done most of my job for me, Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice a low gravel. "What's the one question you need answered? Where does the rest of the money come from?" I replied without hesitation. He nodded slowly. "I'll find out." The week that followed was one of the longest of my life. I went through the motions of my daily routine gardening, errands, calls with friends, but my mind was elsewhere, operating on a second, hidden track of anxious anticipation. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat. I tried not to imagine what Frank was discovering, what sordid details might be unearthed. I simply waited, trusting the process, trusting the cold, hard logic of the investigation I had set into motion. The call finally came the following Tuesday. "Grace," Frank's voice said, using my first name as we had agreed. "I think you should come in. There's something you need to see." I drove to his office with a sense of grim finality. The truth, whatever it was waiting for me in that sterile room. Frank didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured for me to sit and slid a plain manila folder across the desk. "Her routine is mostly as you suspected," he began. "Private yoga sessions in the mornings. But her afternoons are spoken for." I opened the folder. The first thing I saw was a series of photographs, all taken with a long lens camera, all perfectly in focus. My breath caught in my chest. There was Amber, not in yoga attire, but in elegant dresses and expensive coats. In every single photo, she was with a man, a handsome, well-dressed man with silvering temples and a confident smile. I didn't recognize him. They were pictured at an upscale restaurant on the outskirts of town, laughing intimately over a bottle of wine. They were seen entering a boutique hotel, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. The final photos were the most damning, the two of them browsing in a high-end jewelry store, Amber holding up a diamond bracelet to her wrist, her face alight with avarice. "His name is Carter Miller," Frank said, his voice flat and devoid of judgment as he slid a typed report toward me. "Married, owns one of the largest construction companies in the state. He's been transferring significant sums of money to a private account in your daughter-in-law's name for the past 18 months. The transfers are listed as consulting fees for wellness and corporate branding advice." I stared at the photographs, at the undeniable evidence of a long-term, clandestine affair. The initial shock of the betrayal was there, a sharp, painful jolt, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else. A feeling I recognized instantly: the cold, satisfying click of a final puzzle piece slotting into place. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business transaction. Carter Miller wasn't just her lover. He was the missing variable. He was the second, and far more lucrative, source of income. The affair explained everything: the spending, the secrecy, the confidence that bordered on arrogance. Amber wasn't just cheating on my son. She was running a sophisticated, multifaceted operation to fund her life, with Ryan providing the foundation of legitimacy and a free place to live, while Carter Miller provided the vast sums of disposable cash. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. And in that moment, I knew that a simple eviction was no longer a sufficient response. This wasn't just about getting her out of my house. This was about dismantling her entire fraudulent enterprise.